Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Battle Gamer, and today we're talking about the new monk slash martial artist stuff from the Tian Xia character guide. I'm very interested to see. Well, I mean, I've already looked it over, but I'm very interested to show you guys what they have in this book. And honestly, I'll say just ahead of time, I'm a bit whelmed by it. It's fine. They introduced essentially 3 new stances and their trees, which are a good number of feats, by the way. But I don't know. It just feels like there's a lot of missed potential, especially in a book so focused around martial arts that we're only really getting about 2 to 3 pages of new stuff in a 138 page book. So I don't know, but I do like a lot of the options that they have here. So before we get into it, though, I do want to state that Paizo did send me a copy of the Tian Xia character guide. You guys have heard this spiel before. This is not a sponsored video. They're not paying me to do these reviews. They just gave me a book to review. And so all thoughts and opinions here are my own. Though, if you do want to help support the channel, you can get into the AM shirts using the code down in the description below. They're really nice shirts. I talk about them in a lot of my videos. I'm not going to do the whole thing this time around. Just know it's a 10% discount, and you can get 3 shirts for under 20 bucks each if you do their 3 graphic tee deal with my code. So if you need new shirts, check it out. It helps the channel out, and I'd really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started. So the martial arts section of the book includes what's called martial arts philosophies. These are mostly fluff, and one of the things that I find very strange is they dedicate a page and a half to this section of the book. Now, I'm all for giving the world some more lived-in kind of things. These philosophies are essentially like martial arts schools that you follow, and they recommend certain feats. So, for instance, the Cyclone's Path here tells you a little bit about the story of where it was founded, what it uses, and then it recommends a bunch of feats at the bottom you can see here. So, all well and good. They introduce 4 of these, but because they're mostly fluff, I kind of just wish that they had shrunk the text, put this all on one page, and made it more of like a sidebar kind of deal than to take up as much space as they did in the book. I do find these interesting, but they're not really a lot of player options, and it feels like a bit of a waste to dedicate so much space to it. But after that section, we immediately get into the new monk feat, starting off with the rushing goat stance. So the rushing goat stance requires that you're unarmored. It's an action to get into, pretty standard. Now, in the stance, the only strikes you can make are the ramming horn attacks. These strikes deal a D8 bludgeoning damage, are in the brawling group, and have the forceful, non-lethal, shove, and unarmed traits. Overall, a really okay. Forceful, I think, is really good for martial arts stance in general, because with flurry of blows, you get to make multiple strikes more often, and so you just deal more damage. So forceful is good. Shove, this whole stance is about shoving, and I don't know about you guys in your games. Maybe you can let me know in the comments below. Shoving just doesn't come up a bunch. I definitely see some of the strategic use for shoving, but shoving just feels oftentimes like a waste of an attack action when you could have just done damage instead. Now, of course, in some situations where you can throw an enemy off of a building or something like that, definitely good, but you're out in the middle of the woods, pushing an enemy is just repositioning them. So it's not necessarily the most, I don't want to say optimal, it's not the most effective maneuver. Though the stance does come with some additional benefits, since it is an exclusionary stance, which means you can only use the given strike by the stance, it does come with some additional benefits. One of which is whenever you make a ramming horn attack and your previous action was to climb, stride, or leap, you gain a circumstance bonus to the damage equal to the number of weapon damage dice. You can make ramming horn strikes while climbing, even if you don't have a free hand. Climbing is going to be one of the very frequent parts of the rest of the rushing goat feats, but I don't know how often people are climbing. Climbing is so tedious in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Like, I get it, it's thematic, it's a goat thing, right? But, like, why are so many of these features baked into climbing, honestly? It's interesting, and maybe, I don't know. Climbing, like I said, is oftentimes more tedious than it is worth investing in when you could just get a magic item that makes you fly or jump really high or something like that. So, but we get it. And what I do really like about the stance is the stride or leap parts, because that circumstance bonus to damage is really nice whenever you're engaging or using some of the other feats in the rushing goat stance. Though, I will say this circumstance bonus does not stack with forceful. So intermixing movement with your strikes is not going to necessarily net you more damage than if you just had planted your feet and continued striking. So I dislike that those two parts clash of it, but overall I don't really have too much to complain about when it comes to the rushing goat stance. Next up is the twisting petal stance. Now this one is a lot more interesting in my eyes. It's based on the use of deception. You do need to be trained in deception to take this, and this is another one that requires that you are unarmored. Now, what's really cool about this one in particular is this one is not exclusionary, so you can deal a d6 slashing damage, and these slashing strikes are in the brawling group, have agile, finesse, non-lethal, and shove. Again, we get more shove, which is very strange, but the whole point of this particular stance is it's kind of like Aikido in a way. It's kind of like using the enemy's momentum to throw them off balance, more or less. Also, while you're in the twisting petal stance, you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to athletics checks to shove, and a +2 circumstance bonus to your fort DC to avoid being shoved. You also gain a +1 circumstance bonus to deception checks to feint, and a +2 circumstance bonus to your perception DC to resist being feinted, more or less. So it's very interesting because it gives you bonus to do a thing and then bonus to resist the same thing. Very interesting. Now, I don't know how often you're getting shoved in combat. Maybe it happens more in your games than it does mine. But the resistance to being feinted actually does come up a lot in my games as enemies that have good deception. I try to throw feints in. It's something that, only makes sense. So twisting petal stance is really cool. It's not exclusionary, and it gives you some really good benefits. So even if you are using this with monastic weaponry, you're still going to get some really solid benefits. Moving on, we have Momentous Charge. This is a 2-action rushing goat specific action, which is really cool. Now you do need to be in your rushing goat stance. And, I keep saying this. I'm going to say Russian goat eventually. I know I'm saying rushing goat, but there's some part of my brain that keeps hearing Russian. So, welcome, comrade. We do martial arts together. Rushing goat stance. Now, you rush into your enemies with great reckless force. You climb, stride, or leap, then make a ramming horn strike. On a success, the target struck is pushed back 10 feet directly away from you, and on critical strike, the target is also stunned 1. So this is not really action compression. I guess it kind of is, because you get to stride, strike, and essentially shove, though rather than making an athletic check, you just automatically shove the enemy back 10 feet as long as you hit. That's good, but because you're not using the shove action, you don't get to follow them. So the only use for this one I would see under raw rules is pushing an enemy off of a cliff or something, because you would then need to stride or whatever again to then be adjacent to them to continue fighting said enemy. Maybe you could push them into an ally, so an ally doesn't have to move, sure. But because this isn't actually a shove action, that seems really silly. So, Momentous Charge, I think, is designed for pushing enemies off of a building or something like that. Everywhere else, it makes it more niche. Not necessarily bad and a good tool to have in your kit, but it definitely is not something you're going to use in, I would say, a majority of fighting scenarios. finally, we get here to the Kaiju stance, which I know a lot of you are very excited about. This is the third monk stance essentially being introduced here. Now, this is an uncommon one, and it does have an interesting requirement that you've encountered a Kaiju and survived. So kind of fun. Now, a one action stance, this one requires that you're unarmored. And this one has the polymorph trait because when you get into this stance, you become large and clumsy one. Now, the only strikes you can make in this stance are shattering earth strikes, which sounds really cool. And these strikes deal a d8 bludgeoning damage, are in the brawling group, and have backswing, fatal d12, which is really good, reach, and unarmed traits. Now, reach does seem weird, but you are not affected by enlarge, which means you don't get the bonus damage from the enlarge spell, and you don't gain the reach increase. You just are considered a larger character, so the fact that this stance gives you reach actually makes a lot of sense, though it does suck that we don't get the bonus additional damage. I would have just honestly preferred that you just are under the effects of enlarge while you're in this stance, because then they don't need to include the reach and you get bonus damage. So that seems like a miss to me personally. Also, when you consider it, it does exactly the same amount of damage as the bludgeoning goat, the rushing goat stance's ramming horn. So it seems weird that you're doing the same amount of damage, even though you're much bigger and like more impressive now, essentially. I don't know. Anyway, on a critical success with one of these strikes, all creatures other than you within 10 feet of the target, including the target itself, take 1 point of bludgeoning damage per weapon damage die, while in the Kaiju stance, you ignore difficult terrain. So this is actually a pretty good stance, all things considered. Fatal D12 is really, really good, and it makes you really good on stomping on mooks or any other kind of lesser enemies. Against greater enemies, it's a little bit harder to crit, so you're not going to see it as often, but you're a monk, you strike many times in a round, so you're likely to see a crit here or there. Really good. The one thing that I kind of dislike is all creatures are affected by your criticals. So if you're fighting alongside allies or you're in a smaller area, Kaiju stance becomes more of a liability, even though your allies are probably not going to be super upset at losing 1 to 4 HP when you crit, because in the end, it on the damage scale, your group is getting a massive advantage against the enemy. So, I like this stance a lot. I think it's really, really cool. Very, very interesting. I feel like it could have been tuned a little bit better. I think just getting enlarged would have been perfectly fine, but I think this is really cool, and it leads into some really interesting feats later. Next up, we have a Twisting Petal stance feat. This is Scattering in Spring. This is a really good one. It's a reaction with a trigger. An enemy within your reach targets you with a melee attack, and you're aware of the attack. You do need to be in your Twisting Petal stance to use this, which makes a lot of sense. You avoid the incoming attack by twisting your enemy's tactics in your favor. You gain a +2 circumstance bonus to AC against the triggering attack. If the attack misses you, you can immediately attempt to feint or shove the target. And if you roll a success, you get a critical success instead. Now, this actually is one of the situations where shove is actually really cool, because this one, as a part of a reaction, means you're not wasting action economy on it. And so as a reaction, shoving the enemy can position in a better situation, can put the enemy in a really disadvantageous position on their turn. And there's a lot of really interesting ways to use this. The feint is also really good because you can just open the enemy up for any of your attacks on your next turn, because especially since you get a critical success on a success, they are just going to be off guard to you until the end of your next turn, which is really good. So overall, Scattering in Spring, honestly, Twisting Petal stance of the 3 stances so far are some of my favorite stance feats. Sorry, Rushing Goat. It just, there's so many parts of Rushing Goat that I want to like, and they just seem a bit odd. Speaking on Rushing Goat, by the way, we have 5 Gods Ram. Now, this requires that you're in the Rushing Goat stance, and this is a 3-action ability. Oh no, let's see what it does. So you stride or climb. Yeah, I know. And then make a ramming horn strike. If the strike is successful, you immediately push the target back 10 feet. then stride or climb and make a second ramming horn strike against them. If the second strike is successful, you immediately knock the target prone. But if the second strike fails, or you're unable to complete all the required actions, which means any of the strides or whatever, you become stunned 1. Both strikes count towards your multi-attack penalty, but the penalty doesn't increase until you've made both of them. So we're seeing a situation here that's slightly better than the Godbreaker. Even though Godbreaker is such a cool feat, it does run into the map problem because there's no map efficiency. This one does have a map efficiency, and it is very interesting because you essentially get to stride, strike, shove, stride, strike, shove again, or, well, trip again, which is a lot of action efficiency for 3 actions. And because you get to shove the enemy, then essentially trip the enemy because they are knocked prone, this allows you to put an enemy into a really bad spot against your team. Good for your team, bad for them. I think this is really good. Now, this brings up my earlier complaint, though, of because there's strides or climbs in the middle of all this, you're getting the benefit to the extra damage from rushing goat stance. But if you're striking in the same target multiple times, you're also missing out on the forceful. Now, overall, this is more damage efficient because the initial stride adds damage to your first strike, while forceful would only add damage to your second strike. But it makes forceful seem unnecessary as a part of the stance, and I wish instead we had gotten some other benefit than forceful, because it's just not going to play a factor into how this particular feat works. There's still some situations where, yeah, of course, forceful is still going to be good, but I'm just saying that there is some clashing design here where you're not getting the full efficiency out of a stance in one of its own feats, which seems strange. Regardless, an insanely good feat, actually. It's really solid. The only part that sucks is if you miss a strike, you become stunned 1, or if you're unable to move for whatever reason. So this is a very double-edged sword kind of feat, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And because your map doesn't increase until after the actions are done, that's not necessarily a super big issue. But if you're in a high-level encounter, for instance, this can be a double-edged sword, because while you don't have to make any checks against an enemy that probably has really high DCs, you do have a higher chance of missing one of your strikes and then completely foobarring this up. Now, it's only on the second strike or movement that you can get the stunned condition off. Still, it makes it something that I feel like is going to trip some players up. I don't even think that part was honestly necessary here, but I guess knocking an enemy prone and shoving in an enemy without a save is very, very strong. So yeah, 5 gods ram, goats, gods. This is tripping my tongue up. I have dyslexia. You can't do this to me, Paizo. Is a really good stance with some weird caveats in there. Next up, we have the Whirling in the Summer Storm. This is another 3 action ability used when you're in your twisting petal stance. So for 3 actions, you step, then each enemy within reach must attempt a will save against the higher of your class DC or deception DC. On a failure, they're off guard to your melee attacks from you and your allies until the end of your next turn. Then you can shove up to 3 adjacent enemies. Each shove counts towards your multi-attack penalty, but you don't increase your penalty until you resolved all of the shove attempts. So this one is really good, even though it doesn't do any damage. So this is kind of one of those feats that I really like, because strategically speaking, you're sacrificing your turn to split up some enemies, make them all off guard to you and your allies, and setting your team up to do some other really cool things. Really solid. But this damage efficiency wise is really bad, because you're essentially sacrificing 2, maybe even 3 strikes, potentially 4 if you're really going gung-ho about it, to just make an enemy weaker to your allies, and then you won't get to do any damage until your next turn. So it's like you get less damage, but you make the enemies vulnerable to all your allies' damage, which that off guard might not even factor into your allies' hits. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So it's not a pure efficient condition to be in. And as well, the shove can be good. And because you're rolling individual shoves, this is the shove action. So you can move along with them, though I assume you do need to essentially do it in an order where you can move with the last one you shove, more or less. So there's a lot of moving parts to this one. I think this is good. I think this sets up your team for a lot of success and is incredibly solid. Though if we're looking at the overall efficiency of the stance, I'm not sure. Now, the deception DC part is actually pretty hype. Skill proficiencies tend to be higher than your character's class DC more often than not anyway. So this just makes your ability even harder to resist for your enemies. So overall, the twisting petal stance is really, really good at making the enemies off guard, using a lot of movement. I think it's a very fun stance. And this particular feat, even though it's 3 actions, I think is really good, though it is a little niche because you need to be able to essentially step and be within range of multiple enemies, so you need enemies to be clumped up. It happens, but, your mileage may vary. Next up, we have World-Breaking Footfall. This is for the Kaiju stance. It's a 2-action ability that requires that you're in your Kaiju stance and touching the ground. Now, you slam the ground with a fearsome roar, sending broken shards of earth flying in all directions. The ground in a 20-foot emanation. You're large, by the way. So it's a 20-foot emanation around a large character, which is a massive amount of territory, all becomes difficult terrain, or greater difficult terrain if it was already difficult terrain. All other creatures within the emanation take 7d6 bludgeoning damage with a basic reflex saving throw against your class DC. You can't use World-Breaking Footfall again for a d4 rounds. The d4 rounds part I always find super weird. Sure, it makes sense, I guess. Even if this is once per 10 minutes, I think this would be good. My ultimate problem with this one is it's all creatures, again, in the emanation, which is a 20-foot emanation, which is a massive chunk out of the battlefield. And it's 70. This isn't like the normal strikes where if you crit, you do a couple points of bludgeoning damage. This is 76 bludgeoning damage to these creatures. So your allies are going to be very unhappy if you decide to do this in a confined or close area, meaning World-Breaking Footfall is something that you need to be able to get away from your team from to use effectively. Also, it creates difficult terrain. Now, there's a lot of classes that get around difficult terrain, and I feel like Kaiju stance is a very interesting stance for a team built specifically for getting around difficult terrain. So there's some really interesting uses, but you have to be aware of your positioning and your positioning around your allies. So that being said, this one's very much a catch-22. I think it's got some interesting elements to it, but I feel like more often than not, it's going to be either hard to use or is going to hurt your allies, neither of which are really a good situation. So I like it, but I admit it does have some flaws. And a level 20 feat, so you know it's going to be good for Kaiju stance. We have a Wake of Devastation. What's utterly insane about this particular feat is this just enhances your Kaiju stance. It's not a special action. There's no special requirements. Your Kaiju stance just levels up, which is insanely cool. So when you pick up this particular feat, your Shattering Earth strikes gain the Raising trait, which makes you good at destroying objects. Probably should have already been good at that if I'm going to be honest, but, again, we could have just enlarged and then not had reach and take Raising instead. That's not the big part about the stance, so don't worry. And whenever you succeed on a Shattering Earth attack, the force of the blow causes all squares beneath you to become difficult terrain. So that greater difficult terrain is a lot easier to create now. And whenever you critically succeed with a Shattering Earth attack against a creature standing on ground in an area of difficult terrain, you pummel them into the ground and they become immobilized until they succeed at an escape attempt against your class DC. They are trapped forever until they make an escape attempt. That is insane. That's on a critical strike, so they're already taking additional bludgeoning damage from, it's probably 4 additional bludgeoning damage from the strike at all. And of course, there you just drill them into the ground and they now must spend an action to get away or not move for the remainder of the fight. And you're a giant kaiju person, they're not going to want to stand immediately next to you. It's a really good feat, honestly. Wake of Devastation, if you're going kaiju stance, is really good. Now, if you compare this to many other level 20 feats, I don't know, but if you're already going the kaiju stance, I mean, you might as well pick this one up. It just makes your core stance better anyway. But I mean, and if you don't have kaiju stance, you can't select it anyway. So I guess that's kind of a moot point. Though I can definitely see other kaiju players, kaiju stance users, not picking this one up for some of the other really good level 20 feats. I think this one is still pretty good. Now, moving on to the martial artist feat changes, we only get 2 new feats, though technically we get access to a lot of new feats because the rushing goat and twisting petal stance and some of their feats come along with them. So here we have rushing goat, twisting petal stance. We also get advanced monastic weaponry. You also get momentous charge, scattering spring, 5 gods ram, and whirling in the summer. So you get all their feats, just no kaiju stuff, which is ultimately really, really sad. But what's not sad is adamantine body. So this is actually a really, really cool feat for martial artist dedication. It's a reaction. It requires an attack or effect that would deal damage to you. So pretty much any kind of situation you take damage, you can get resistance to that damage equal to 2 plus half your level. And this is all damage from the triggering attack or effect, which means if the attack has multiple damage types, you gain even more effective resistance against that attack. That's insanely good. This is a huge boon for martial artist dedication and is absolutely massive. It's something that's very, very interesting, and I love to see that we are getting a really good resistance-based feat in the martial artist dedication, because that's kind of one of the core things about martial arts is training your body to be harder than steel, essentially. So really, really cool. Also, we get echoing violence. Now, this feat, honestly, I really want to see more feats like this in Pathfinder. I feel like that would level up the game a little bit. So this is a free action based on whenever you critically succeed an unarmed strike against an opponent. Now, you can only use this once per minute, so effectively only once per combat, but that's not a big deal. Now, this does have the death and incapacitation traits. So be warned, the DEC, if it's against a higher enemy, is going to be not as effective. But against lower enemies, this is really good. So essentially, whenever you critically strike, once per minute, whenever you critically strike with an unarmed strike against an opponent, you shake their internal organs up with the strike. The strike deals an additional 10d6 bludgeoning damage with a basic fortitude save against your class DC. And if they critically fail this save, they die as your blow tears apart its body internally. Echoing violence is insanely cool, but I want to make special mention of it because this is actually a kind of feat I feel like Monk would really benefit from. Any kind of feats, even if they're once per minute or whatever, that's a free action off of a critical strike. And this can be for anything outside of Monk too. It's just critical strikes are somewhat rare, not super reliable. So feats that benefit critical strikes are very interesting. And an additional free action for striking an enemy very well, I think would add an interesting dynamic where you get the situation where your attack is no longer dealing damage to the HP of an enemy, but now your attacks are potentially dealing like debilitations. You're actually shaking the enemy up as a part of hitting them critically, which is like hitting them in the head, hitting them in a part that shouldn't be hit, that kind of stuff. So I want to see more feats like this one, not necessarily like instant death feats or do more damage death feats, but Paizo, please introduce more feats that are just free action based on a critical strike. You can choose to do additional things. I would think I would select that more often, and I think most classes could get some interesting benefits. Heck, even magic casters, if an enemy crit fails one of their spells, being able to do a little something extra on top of that would be really, really cool. So hopefully this feat becomes a new trend and we're going to see more stuff like this. It's not necessarily likely, but for a martial artist feat, I think it's very fitting. It makes your attacks incredibly devastating and very mechanically cruel in a way. Like, the martial artist has always been an effective class. It's not very flowy, flashy, whatever. It mostly focuses on taking an enemy down brawler style, and echoing violence, I think, is perfect for that. But hey, that's going to be it for the video. Now, I did have a bit of criticisms about this. I'm just looking at it from my own perspective and the perspective I would feel other players might have. And I'm just trying to be as unbiased as possible. I love Paizo. I love their stuff, but that is all the more reason why I should be as critical as I can. Now, a lot of this section I didn't even really talk about is they added some sidebars talking about real world martial arts and other things related. So this does add a lot of new flair for monks and martial artists specifically, but I really, really wish we had just gotten a couple more pages in this martial arts based book for monk and or for martial artists, because in all honesty, I don't know when we're going to see more monk stuff. It just doesn't come up a lot. And monk's already a really good class, so it's not like it needs the extra benefit. But in a book so dedicated around martial artists, I find it very strange that monk only really got a couple pages where we got like multiple pages dedicated to cooking and to medicine and as well to like some of the archetypes. I wanted to see a little bit more. I wanted to see some more cool monk stuff. And while a lot of the feats here and a lot of the archetypes can apply to monks and do really apply to monks, like the 5 breath Vanguard dedication, which I'll talk about in a different video, I feel like the monk could have gotten just a little bit more love because we don't know when we're going to see more monk stuff. Anyway, just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And hey, give this video a like. And in fact, if anyone is looking into other videos, give a like to those videos if you like them as well. As the more people who are checking out Pathfinder content, especially a stellar book like the Tian Xia character guide, the more I feel like people are going to be interested. This book is really, really good. It's actually insane how many cool new features were put into this book. And it's been so far my favorite book of the year. So the more people who get to hear about this kind of book in Pathfinder, I feel like more people will start checking Pathfinder out. And if you like my content specifically, subscribe. I talk about all things tabletop, but I especially cover things around Paizo's products, like the new books, which are still 2 new books coming out later this year. I have a video for every day of the rest of this week at the very least. And I talk about other tabletop stuff. So if you want all your tabletop news, subscribe. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.